While the streets of Paris burned with revolution, the poor struggled just to find a place to rest. Forget warm beds, most slept on cold floors, crowded together in filthy rooms, with the sound of distant gunfire and hunger gnawing through the night. Tonight, we step quietly into those shadowed alleys and broken homes to see how the common people tried to sleep while history was being torn apart outside their doors. If soft whispers from the hardest chapters of history help ease your mind, you're in the right place. Thus, subscribe now and tap the bell icon for more gentle journeys into the forgotten struggles of the past. Before we continue, I'd love to know where are you listening from and what time is it for you. It's always amazing to see how far our quiet little stories are reaching. In the narrow, winding streets of the Faubourg Saint-Antoine, as the church bells of Paris chimed their evening call across the sprawling city, you could hear the slow, rhythmic clatter of wooden clogs echoing through stone stairwells. These were not the footsteps of merchants returning to comfortable homes, nor the measured gait of artisans heading to well-appointed workshops. These were the weary steps of Paris's forgotten poor, climbing 4, 5, sometimes 6 flights of narrow, creaking stairs to reach their homes in the sky, the garrets that crowned the tenement buildings like afterthoughts. Spaces so small and cramped that even the architects who designed the buildings below seemed to have forgotten they existed. Marie-Claire Dubois, a seamstress of 32 years who had spent the last 14 years of her life in various garrets throughout the Faubourg Saint-Antoine, would begin her nightly ascent sometime after the sun had begun its descent behind the smoke-darkened chimneys of Paris. Her day began before dawn in the workshop of Monsieur Ravelin, the wallpaper manufacturer, whose name would soon become synonymous with the riots that would herald the revolution. For 12 hours, she would sit hunched over delicate patterns, her fingers moving with the practiced precision of someone who had learned that the difference between earning 15 sous and 20 could mean the difference between eating that evening and going to bed with nothing but water in her stomach. The stairwell that led to her garret was a study in gradual decay and diminishing hope. On the first floor lived the landlord's family, with their proper furniture, glass windows, and rooms large enough for separate sleeping and eating spaces. The second floor housed the more prosperous artisans, a carpenter, a baker's widow with a small pension, a clerk who worked for a merchant near Les Halles. By the third floor, the apartments grew smaller, the windows more grimy, the smells more pungent. The fourth floor was where respectability began to fray at the edges, where families of 4 or 5 shared spaces no larger than what had once been storage rooms. But Marie-Claire's destination lay beyond even these compromised accommodations. Her garret, like hundreds of others scattered across the rooftops of the Faubourg, was located in what had originally been designed as nothing more than attic space, a void between the roof and the highest proper floor. Never intended for human habitation, but gradually carved up and rented out as the population of Paris swelled and the demand for any kind of shelter, no matter how inadequate, grew beyond all reason. The journey from street level to her garret took Marie-Claire nearly 10 minutes on a good day. Longer when the arthritis in her knees, brought on by years of sitting in cold, damp workshops, made each step a small act of endurance. The stairs themselves told the story of Paris's social hierarchy with startling clarity. The first 2 flights were wide enough for 2 people to pass comfortably, constructed of solid wood that had once been properly maintained. By the 3rd floor, the staircase had narrowed, and the wood showed the accumulated wear of decades of heavy foot traffic with no corresponding investment in repair. By the time she reached the 4th floor, the staircase had become little more than a ladder, narrow, steep steps that required her to use both hands for balance, especially when carrying the small bundle of mending work that provided her with an additional 3 or 4 sous per week. The handrail, such as it was, consisted of a rough wooden beam attached to the wall with iron brackets, many of which had worked loose over the years, making the support unreliable at best. The 5th floor, where her garret was located, was reached. By a final flight of steps so narrow that carrying anything larger than a loaf of bread became a logistical challenge. The ceiling at this level sloped sharply downward, following the roofline of the building, so that even a person of average height had to duck to avoid hitting their head. The air here carried a different quality than the air in the lower floors thinner. Somehow, and always tinged with the smell of roof tar, rain-soaked wood, and the accumulated odors of too many people living in too little space with too few opportunities for proper sanitation. Marie Claire's garret measured approximately 8 feet by 12 feet at its widest point. Though the sloping ceiling meant that she could stand upright only in a space roughly 4 feet wide down the center of the room, the ceiling at its lowest point came to within 3 feet of the floor, creating triangular spaces along the edges that were useful only for storage of the few possessions she had managed to accumulate over her years of residence in the garret. Community of the Faubourg. The room's single window was perhaps the most precious feature of her accommodation, a small, rectangular opening no more than 2 feet wide and 18 inches tall, fitted with 4 panes of glass that were, remarkably, still intact. This window faced east, which meant that for a few hours each morning, if the weather was clear, actual sunlight would penetrate the gloom of her living space. During the winter months, this brief daily infusion of natural light became something approaching a religious experience, a reminder that somewhere beyond the maze of slanted roofs and smoking chimneys, the sun still rose each day as it had for countless generations before. Paris had grown into the sprawling maze of humanity. It had become the furnishings of Marie Claire's garret reflected both the constraints of her economic circumstances and the practical necessities of living in a space where every square inch had to serve multiple purposes. Her bed consisted of a simple wooden frame, roughly constructed from pine boards and measuring about 5 feet in length and 3 feet in width. The frame sat directly on the floor, with no legs or other elevation, partly because anything taller would have interfered with the sloping ceiling, and partly because the cost of a proper bedstead was simply beyond her means. The mattress was a canvas sack filled with straw that she purchased from a farmer on the outskirts of Paris every 3 or 4 months, depending on her financial circumstances and the condition of the existing bedding. The straw, when fresh, provided reasonable comfort and insulation, but as the weeks passed, it would gradually break down, becoming dusty and less effective at cushioning her body against the hard wooden floor. During the winter months, she would sometimes supplement the straw with rags, old newspapers, or any other material that might provide additional warmth and comfort. Her blanket was a patchwork creation that told the story of her years in the garret community. The base was a wool blanket she had purchased secondhand during her first year in the Faubourg, when she still harbored hopes of eventually moving to better accommodations. Over the years, as the original fabric had worn thin or developed holes, she had patched it with scraps of cloth from her sewing work, creating a covering that was warm and functional, if not particularly attractive. During the coldest months, she would layer this primary blanket with her winter coat, her spare dress, and any other clothing that could provide additional insulation. The remainder of her furniture was sparse and entirely practical. A single wooden chair purchased from a carpenter's widow for 6 sous served as seating during meals, as a surface for her sewing work, and as a step stool when she needed to reach items stored in the triangular spaces under the eaves. A small wooden table, barely large enough to hold a plate and cup, doubled as a workspace for her mending and as storage for her few books, a prayer book inherited from her mother, and a small collection of pamphlets that circulated among the working people of the Faubourg, discussing topics ranging from the price of bread to the political situation that seemed to grow more tense with each passing month. Her cooking arrangements were necessarily simple. A small brazier fueled by charcoal, when she could afford it, or by scraps of wood gathered from construction sites around the city. provided heat for basic food preparation. The brazier sat near the window, where the smoke could escape through gaps in the window frame, though this arrangement was far from perfect. And during the winter months, when the window remained tightly closed, the air in the garret would often become thick with smoke and difficult to breathe. Water was perhaps the most challenging aspect of daily life in the garret. The building had no running water above the second floor, which meant that every drop of water needed for drinking, cooking, or washing had to be carried up 5 flights of stairs from the courtyard. Well, Marie-Claire had developed a routine of carrying water twice daily, once in the morning before leaving for work, and once in the evening upon her return. She used 2 pottery jugs, each holding about 2 quarts, which provided enough water for basic needs but required careful conservation. Sanitation in the garret presented its own unique challenges. The building's privy was located in the courtyard and was shared among all the residents of the building, roughly 40 people in total. For the garret dwellers, a nighttime trip to the privy required the same 10-minute journey down 5 flights of stairs that marked every departure from their aerial accommodations. As a result, most garret residents, Marie-Claire included, kept a chamber pot in their rooms for nighttime use. The chamber pot would be emptied each morning during the first trip to the courtyard. Though during illness or harsh weather, this routine could be disrupted, leading to sanitary conditions that were less than ideal. The social dynamics of garret life created a community of sorts among the residents of the building's uppermost floors. Marie-Claire's immediate neighbors included Jean-Baptiste, a day laborer who worked at construction sites around Paris when work was available; Madame Rousseau, a widow who took in washing when her health permitted; and the Moreau family, a couple with 2 young children who had been living in their single garret room for nearly 3 years. These neighbors shared not only the physical proximity of their adjacent living spaces, but also the common challenges of garret life: the daily climb, the isolation from the street-level community, the constant financial pressure that made their tenuous hold on even these inadequate accommodations a source of ongoing anxiety. The evening routine in the garret community began as the sun set and the temperature began to drop. With no artificial lighting beyond what could be provided by candles, a luxury that most garret dwellers could afford only occasionally, rhythm of life followed the natural cycle of daylight with a precision that had been lost to more prosperous urban residents. As darkness fell, the sounds from the street below would gradually diminish, replaced by the intimate sounds of the garret community, the murmur of conversations through thin walls, the crying of infants, the coughing that seemed to be a constant companion of life in the damp, poorly ventilated spaces under the eaves. Marie-Claire's evening meal was typically simpler piece of bread, purchased that morning from the bakery on the street level, sometimes supplemented by a thin soup made from vegetables bought at the end of the market day when vendors were eager to sell their remaining stock at reduced prices. On particularly good days when her earnings had been higher than usual, or when she had completed additional mending work, she might add a small piece of cheese or a few strips of salted meat to her meal. These small luxuries were carefully planned and savored, representing not just additional nutrition but also brief moments of pleasure in a life that offered few such opportunities. The act of preparing for sleep in the garret required its own specific set of adaptations to the constraints of the space and the season. During the summer months, when the temperature under the roof could become stifling, Marie-Claire would often sleep in her chemise alone, with the window opened as wide as possible and the blanket folded and stored against the wall. The sloping ceiling actually provided some advantage during these hot months, as the heat would rise to the highest point of the room, leaving the sleeping area relatively cooler. Winter preparations were far more complex and crucial for survival. As the temperature dropped, the garret became a delicate balance between the need for warmth and the dangers of carbon monoxide poisoning from the brazier. Marie-Claire had learned, through experience and the advice of her neighbors, to extinguish the brazier at least an hour before sleep, allowing the room to ventilate while still retaining some residual heat. She would then bundle herself in every piece of clothing she owned, creating layers of insulation that would trap her body heat throughout the night. Her pre-sleep routine included checking the small gaps around the window frame, which she would stuff with rags during the coldest months to prevent drafts, while still maintaining enough ventilation to prevent the air from becoming dangerously stale. She would arrange her spare clothing around the edges of her mattress, creating additional insulation between her body and the cold wooden floor. On the coldest nights, she would even wear her knitted cap to bed, following the common wisdom that much of the body's heat was lost through the head. The sounds of the garret community, settling in for the night, created a symphony of urban poverty that was both comforting and sobering. Through the thin walls, Marie-Claire could hear the Moreau children being settled into their shared bed, a mattress barely larger than her own that somehow accommodated a family of 4. Madame Rousseau's cough, a persistent reminder of the lung ailment that had developed during her years of breathing the damp air of the garret, would echo through the evening until it finally faded into the deeper rhythms of sleep. From June Baptist's room came the sounds of a man trying to forget the uncertainties of his daily existence, sometimes the low murmur of prayers, sometimes the quiet sobs of someone facing another day without certainty of work or income. The thin walls that separated the garret rooms ensured that privacy was largely theoretical. The residents of the upper floors lived with an intimacy born of necessity, sharing not just physical space, but the sounds and smells of their daily struggles. As Marie-Claire lay on her straw mattress, listening to the night sounds of her community and feeling the cold creep through the gaps in the walls despite her careful preparations, she often found her thoughts turning to questions that had no easy answers. How long could she continue to make the daily climb to her aerial perch? What would happen when age or illness made the journey impossible? Where would she go if the landlord decided that even the modest rent she paid for her garret was insufficient to justify maintaining these marginal accommodations? These were not abstract concerns, but immediate, practical questions that shadowed the sleep of every garret dweller in the Faubourg Saint-Antoine. The housing that provided them with shelter was precarious in every sense, physically unstable, economically vulnerable, and socially invisible to the broader community that lived more comfortably at street level. Yet it was home, and for thousands of Parisians in the years leading up to the Revolution. These aerial communities represented not just survival, but a form of urban life that would soon be swept away by forces none of them could have anticipated. But as Marie-Claire pulled her patchwork blanket closer and listened to the wind whistling through the gaps in the roof above her head, she could not know that her garret community was about to become ground zero for a revolution that would transform not just France, but the entire concept of who deserved adequate shelter and under what conditions. The question that would haunt her sleep that night, and countless nights to come, was whether the changes that everyone seemed to sense coming would improve the lot of people like her, or simply replace one form of uncertainty with another. The morning light that filtered through Marie-Claire's small window revealed the true complexity of the garret community that had evolved in the upper reaches of the Faubourg Saint-Antoine's tenement buildings. What appeared from street level to be simply the roofline of ordinary residential structures was, in reality, a hidden city of makeshift accommodations that housed nearly a quarter of the district's working population. The architectural modifications that had transformed unused attic space into human habitation told a story of desperation, ingenuity, and the relentless pressure of urban poverty that characterized life in pre-revolutionary Paris. The building where Marie-Claire lived had originally been constructed in the 1720s as a typical Parisian residential structure, designed to house perhaps 24 people across 4 floors of proper apartments. By 1788, through a process of subdivision and vertical expansion that had taken place gradually over 6 decades, the same building now sheltered more than 60 residents, with the greatest density occurring in the improvised accommodations carved out of the roof space, the process by which attic space had been converted to living Quarters reflected both the ingenuity of the building's various owners and the desperate housing shortage that affected Paris's working poor. The original roof structure consisted of heavy wooden beams that created a triangular space roughly 8 feet high at the peak and extending the full length and width of the building. This space had initially served the practical purpose of providing insulation and protection for the floors below, while also offering storage for the building's residents, as the demand for housing intensified throughout the middle decades of the 18th century. Successive landlords had recognized the economic potential of this unused space. The first modifications had been relatively simple. The installation of a few windows in the sloping roof and the construction of basic wooden partitions to create separate rooms. These early garret conversions had been crude but functional, providing minimal shelter for tenants, who were willing to accept almost any accommodation they could afford. By the time Marie Claire arrived in the Faubourg, the garret conversion process had become considerably more sophisticated, though not necessarily more comfortable for the residents. Her building's roof space had been divided into 8 separate rooms of varying sizes, connected by a network of narrow hallways and makeshift stairs that represented a triumph of creative carpentry over rational design. The wooden partitions that separated the rooms were constructed from whatever materials had been available at the time of construction, sometimes proper lumber, sometimes salvaged wood from demolished buildings, occasionally even repurposed furniture that had been nailed together to create walls. The irregularity of these spaces created unique challenges for each garret dweller. Marie Claire's room was relatively rectangular, but her neighbor, Jean-Baptiste, lived in a triangular space that was 7 feet wide at one end and barely 3 feet wide at the other. Madame Rousseau's accommodation wrapped around a chimney, creating an L-shaped room that was difficult to heat but offered the advantage of slightly more floor space. The Moreau family occupied what had once been the building's main storage area, giving them the largest garret in the building, but also the one with the lowest ceiling, requiring all 4 family members to crawl rather than walk through most of their living space. The heating arrangements in the garret community represented a constant balance between warmth and safety that required careful attention and considerable experience to manage successfully. Each garret room was equipped with some form of heating device, though the variety and condition of these devices reflected the improvised nature of the garret conversions. Marie Claire's brazier was typical of the heating solutions employed throughout the building, non-metal container designed to burn charcoal or wood, with a crude chimney arrangement that was supposed to carry smoke and toxic gases safely outside. The chimney systems for the garret heating devices had been installed as an afterthought to the original roof structure, creating a maze of metal pipes and flues that wound their way between the roof beams and eventually emerged through holes cut in the roof tiles. These installations were frequently inadequate for the purpose they served, and carbon monoxide poisoning was a persistent danger that claimed several lives each winter in buildings. Throughout the Faubourg, the garret dwellers had developed an elaborate set of informal safety protocols to minimize the risks associated with their heating arrangements. These protocols were passed down from experienced residents to newcomers and represented a form of community knowledge that was essential for survival. Windows were never completely sealed, even during the coldest weather, to ensure adequate ventilation. Heating devices were always extinguished well before sleep, regardless of the temperature. Residents learned to recognize the symptoms of carbon monoxide exposure and had developed systems for checking on neighbors who might be in danger. Water access in the garret community required both physical endurance and careful planning. The building's well was located in the central courtyard and served all 60 residents through a single hand pump that operated from dawn until roughly 10 o'clock each evening. The garret dwellers, being furthest from the source and having the most arduous journey to reach it, had developed informal schedules and cooperative arrangements to ensure that everyone's water needs were reasonably met. Marie Claire's daily Water routine began at 5:30 each morning, when she would make her first ascent to the courtyard, carrying her 2 pottery jugs. At this early hour, the courtyard was typically occupied by only a few other residents, allowing her to fill her containers without the long waits that characterized water collection during peak hours. The return journey, carrying nearly 8 pounds of water up 5 flights of increasingly narrow stairs, required careful pacing and strategic rest stops to avoid. Exhaustion before her workday had even begun. The evening water collection was more social but also more challenging. By the time Marie-Claire returned from her work at Monsieur Ravellin's workshop, the courtyard would often be crowded with residents washing clothes, preparing evening meals, and engaging in the informal conversations that constituted much of the building's social life. The wait for access to the pump could extend to 30 minutes or more, and the garret dwellers, being visible reminders of the building's most marginal residents, were often relegated to the end of the unofficial queue. Food storage and preparation. In the garrets required adaptations that reflected both the limitations of the space and the economic constraints of the residents. Marie-Claire's food storage consisted of a wooden box, roughly the size of a modern briefcase, that she kept near the window where the cooler temperatures would help preserve perishables for slightly longer periods. Her typical food supply included bread purchased daily, small quantity of grain or dried beans purchased weekly when possible, occasional vegetables purchased at the end of market days when prices were reduced, and very rarely small amounts of cheese, salted meat, or other protein sources. The challenge of keeping food fresh in the garret environment required constant attention and careful planning. Bread, the staple of Marie-Claire's diet, would begin to go stale within 24 hours of purchase, particularly during humid weather. Rather than waste food that represented a significant portion of her daily income, she had learned to incorporate stale bread into soups and gruels that would extend its nutritional value while making it more palatable. Vegetables that began to spoil were quickly converted into broths that could be consumed over several days, reducing waste while providing some variety in her otherwise monotonous diet. The social organization of the garret community reflected the shared challenges and mutual dependence that characterized life in these marginal accommodations. Formal privacy was virtually impossible in spaces where walls were thin, ceilings were low, and every resident was intimately familiar with the daily routines, health problems, and financial struggles of their neighbors. Rather than creating hostility or resentment, these conditions had fostered a form of community cooperation that was essential for the survival of all residents. Childcare in the garret. Community was a shared responsibility that reflected both necessity and tradition. The Moreau children, ages 4 and 6, were supervised by various adults throughout the building during the hours when their parents were working. Madame Rousseau, whose washing work could be performed in her garret room, often served as an informal daycare provider, watching over children whose parents worked away from the building. Jean Baptiste, during his frequent periods of unemployment, would help with childcare duties in exchange for shared prepared meals or small amounts of money when the families could afford to pay. Medical care in the garret community was almost entirely self-administered and based on folk remedies, shared experience, and mutual assistance. The cost of professional medical attention was far beyond the means of garret residents, and the city's hospitals were viewed with suspicion and fear, being correctly understood as places where poor people went to die rather than to recover. Instead, the garret community had developed its own system of medical knowledge, with certain residents recognized as having particular expertise in treating common ailments. Madame Rousseau, despite her own persistent cough, was regarded as the building's expert on respiratory ailments, having accumulated knowledge through her own struggles with lung disease and her observations of similar conditions among her neighbors. Jean Baptiste had developed expertise in treating the injuries that were common among construction workers, and he frequently provided basic medical care for cuts, sprains, and other work-related injuries. Marie Claire had become the building's specialist in treating the eye strain and hand injuries that were common among seamstresses and other workers who performed detailed manual labor. The financial arrangements that governed garret life reflected the precarious economic position of the residents and the informal nature of many working-class economic relationships. Rent for garret accommodation was typically paid weekly, a schedule that recognized the irregular income patterns of the residents, while also allowing landlords to quickly respond to non-payment by evicting tenants before significant losses accumulated. Marie Claire's rent of 15 sous per week represented roughly 3 days' wages at her current job, a proportion that was typical for garret accommodations throughout the Faubourg. The payment of rent often required creative financial management and mutual assistance among the garret residents. During weeks when work was unavailable or when illness prevented earning, residents would sometimes pool resources to ensure that everyone could meet their rental obligations. These informal loan arrangements were based on trust and mutual dependence, with repayment expected as soon as circumstances allowed, but with considerable flexibility for timing and terms. The relationship between garret, residents, and the buildings. Other tenants reflected the broader social hierarchies that characterized urban life in pre-revolutionary France. The residents of the lower floors artisans, shopkeepers, and clerks who could afford proper apartments generally regarded the garret dwellers with a mixture of sympathy and disdain, while few would actively mistreat their upstairs neighbors. There was little social interaction between the different economic levels within the building. This social segregation was reinforced by practical considerations as well as class distinctions. The garret residents' daily schedule was largely determined by the constraints of their living situation and work requirements, leaving little time or energy for socializing with neighbors who lived more comfortable lives. The physical demands of the 5-flight climb to reach their homes meant that garret dwellers minimized unnecessary trips up and down the stairs, reducing opportunities for casual interaction with other residents. The seasonal rhythms of garret life were more pronounced than those experienced by residents of more comfortable accommodations. During the summer months, when the temperature under the roof could become nearly unbearable, garret residents would often gather in the building's courtyard during the evening hours, creating an outdoor social space that provided relief from the stifling conditions of their rooms. These summer evening gatherings were among the few times when residents from all floors of the building would interact socially. Though even then, the distinctions between garret dwellers and more prosperous residents remained clearly defined. Winter brought its own social dynamics as the combination of cold temperatures and dangerous heating arrangements made the garret community more insular and focused on survival. The risks associated with heating devices created informal support networks, where neighbors would check on each other regularly, ensuring that no one had succumbed to carbon monoxide poisoning or other winter hazards. These safety networks were essential for survival, but they also created a sense of shared vulnerability that reinforced the garret community's sense of separateness from the more secure residents of the lower floors. As Marie Claire lay in her narrow bed on a cold February night in 1789, listening to the familiar sounds of her community settling in for another night of uncertain rest, she could sense that something fundamental was changing in the world beyond her small window. The conversations in the workshops where she worked had grown more intense, more focused on questions of justice and rights and the possibility that the established order might be challenged. The pamphlets that circulated among the working people of the Faubourg spoke of ideas that seemed almost impossible to believe: that poor people might have rights, that the conditions under which they lived might be wrong, that change might be possible. But as she pulled her patched blanket closer and tried to find a comfortable position on her straw mattress, Marie Claire wondered whether any revolution, no matter how profound, could really change the fundamental realities of garret life. Would new political arrangements make the stairs any less steep? Would they make the rooms any larger or the winter nights any warmer? And if the old order was truly crumbling, what would take its place? And would it offer any more security for people like her than the precarious existence she had learned to navigate in her aerial community above the streets of the Faubourg Saint-Antoine? The morning of April 28, 1789 began like any other for Maréchal Dubois, with the familiar routine of her pre-dawn descent to the courtyard. Well, and the careful navigation of 5 flights of stairs while carrying her daily water supply. But as she emerged from her building onto the narrow street that connected the Faubourg Saint-Antoine to the broader network of Parisian thoroughfares, she immediately sensed that something unprecedented was unfolding in her neighborhood. The usual sounds of early morning commerce were replaced by an undercurrent of voices, urgent and animated, carrying news that would fundamentally alter not just the political landscape of France, but the daily reality of life in the garret communities that crowned the tenements of the working districts. Word was spreading through the Faubourg with the speed that only truly shocking news could achieve. Monsieur Ravelin, the wallpaper manufacturer who employed Marie Claire and hundreds of other workers in the district, had allegedly made statements suggesting that workers could survive quite comfortably on wages of 15 sous per day, approximately half of what most of them currently earned. Whether Ravelin had actually made such statements, or whether his words had been distorted and exaggerated as they passed from person to person, will later become a matter of historical debate. But for the garret dwellers and street-level workers who heard these reports on that April morning, the specific accuracy of the quotation mattered far less than what it seemed to represent: a casual dismissal of their struggles by someone who had grown wealthy from their labor. Marie Claire's immediate reaction was not anger, but a kind of sick recognition. 15 sous per day would cover her garret rent with 3 sous left over for food and other necessities. Such an income would make her current way of life ready precarious and demanding, literally impossible to sustain. As she stood in the street, listening to the increasingly agitated conversations around her, she began to understand that what was happening was not simply a labor dispute or even a particularly severe economic crisis, but something that challenged the fundamental assumptions about how society was organized and who deserved what kind of life. The crowd that began forming in the streets of the Faubourg that morning was unlike anything Marie Claire had experienced in her 14 years of residence in the district. The usual social boundaries that separated different categories of workers, skilled artisans from day laborers, pieceworkers from those with steady employment, garret dwellers from residents of proper apartments, seemed to dissolve as people recognized their shared vulnerability to the economic and social forces that Ravelin's alleged statements seemed to represent. Jean Moptist, her garret neighbor, who had been unemployed for 6 of the previous 8 weeks, appeared at Marie Claire's side as the crowd began to move toward Ravelin's workshop. His usual demeanor of resigned acceptance had been replaced by something she had never seen in him before. Kind of focused anger that seemed to carry with it the accumulated weight of years of uncertainty, disrespect, and economic insecurity. "They think we are animals," he said to her as they walked, his voice carrying clearly despite the noise of the crowd around them. "They think we can live on nothing, work for nothing, die for nothing, and it makes no difference." The Ravelin workshop, which had been the source of employment and modest security for hundreds of workers in the Faubourg, had by midday become the focal point for grievances that extended far beyond the immediate question of wages. As Marie Claire found herself swept along with the crowd that surrounded the building, she began to understand that what was taking place was not simply a protest against a particular employer, but an eruption of frustration against the entire system that made garret life necessary and kept working people in a state of perpetual insecurity. The physical destruction that followed was both shocking and strangely methodical. The crowd did not simply riot in the chaotic manner that might have been expected from an undisciplined mob. Instead, there seemed to be an implicit understanding about what deserved to be destroyed and what should be preserved. The machinery that produced Ravelin-esque profitable wallpaper was systematically dismantled. But the raw materials and finished products that represented the actual labor of the workers were largely left alone. The furnishings of Ravelin-esque offices and residential quarters were thrown into the street. But the workers' tools and personal belongings were carefully protected. For Marie Claire, who had spent years accepting the constraints and indignities of garret life as natural and unchangeable, the experience of participating in collective action that successfully challenged established authority was transformative in ways that were difficult to articulate. As she watched furniture from Revelin's comfortable living quarters being thrown from second-story windows, she found herself thinking about the contrast between his accommodations and her garret room. The disparity had always existed, but she had never before seen it as something that might be questioned or challenged. The government's response to the Ravelin riots was swift and violent. Royal troops were deployed to restore order, and the confrontation that followed resulted in dozens of deaths among the workers and their supporters. Marie Claire, who had never before witnessed violent death, found herself crouched behind an overturned cart, watching neighbors and co-workers fall under military gunfire. The immediate lesson was clear. Challenging the established order carried risks that could be fatal. But the deeper implications of the Ravelin riots extended far beyond the immediate question of wages or working conditions. For the first time in their lives, the garret dwellers and street-level workers of the Faubourg had demonstrated that they possessed collective power, that their actions could influence events beyond their immediate neighborhoods, and that the authorities who governed their lives were not as secure or unchallenged as they had previously appeared. The weeks that followed the riots brought changes to garret life that were subtle but significant. The informal networks of mutual support that had always characterized the rooftop communities became more explicitly political, with discussions that went beyond immediate survival needs to encompass larger questions about rights, representation, and social organization. The pamphlets that circulated among the garret dwellers began to address not just economic grievances, but fundamental questions about who deserved adequate housing, fair wages, and basic security. Marie-Claire found that Pré-Mote Ballade, Pré-Mouth Claire found that Pré-Mutes, that pamphlets that circulated among the garret. Dwelling now, squealing, alode. Pré-Mute / my lolly / my wall / HF, HFC. My existive, my / laugh, my menace, my las XF, I be I callis. I criblide, I vas why it's it. I'm so unlike it's it get to me, it's it, by it's it. We I God, you I said a replicit to a glidle, you said it is it sell it stick cock pip it let's it stick the skittera tick that and the device and is set at the bus mega sake this because they her perspective on her own living situation had been fundamentally altered by her participation in the riots. The daily climb to her garret, which she had previously accepted as simply the price of having any shelter at all, now struck her as emblematic of a social system that relegated working people to the margins literally and figuratively of urban life. The inadequacy of her heating, the difficulty of accessing water, the precariousness of her rental arrangement, all began to seem like symptoms of larger injustices rather than simply personal challenges to be endured. The approach of winter in 1789 brought new dimensions to these evolving political consciousness. As Marie Claire made her usual preparations for the cold months, sealing gaps around her window, arranging her spare clothing for maximum warmth, calculating how much charcoal she could afford for her brazier, she found herself thinking about these activities not just as personal survival strategies, but as evidence of a social system that forced working people to risk their health and safety, simply to have shelter. The political developments that were transforming France throughout 1789, the convening of the Estates General, the formation of the National Assembly, The storming of the Bastille seemed simultaneously momentous and distant from the daily realities of garret life. Marie Claire and her neighbors followed these events through the pamphlets and newspapers that circulated in the faubourg, and through the discussions that took place in workshops and courtyards throughout the district. But the practical question remained: what difference would these political changes make for people who lived in 8-foot by 12-foot rooms under the eaves of tenement buildings? The answer began to emerge gradually through the winter of 1789 to 1790, as the revolutionary government began to address questions of housing, employment, and social welfare that had previously been considered beyond the scope of political action. The Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen, with its assertion that all people possessed inherent rights to liberty, property, and security, raised obvious questions about whether garret life was compatible with human dignity and whether society had obligations to ensure that all citizens had access to adequate shelter. The practical implementation of these revolutionary principles in the context of urban housing proved to be far more complex than their philosophical articulation. The landlords who rented garret accommodations were not necessarily wealthy aristocrats, whose property could be confiscated without moral qualms. Many were middle-class property owners who depended on rental income for their own economic security. The buildings that housed the garret communities were not palaces or luxury accommodations, but ordinary, residential structures that served essential housing needs for the urban population. Marie Claire's landlord, Monsieur Bertrand, was a baker, who had purchased the building as an investment for his retirement. His relationship with his garret tenants was not characterized by particular cruelty or exploitation, but rather by the mundane economic calculations that governed most rental arrangements. When revolutionary authorities began to discuss rent controls and tenant rights, Bertrand responded with the practical concern that his investment might become unprofitable, potentially forcing him to abandon the property and leaving his tenants without any housing at all. The garret community's response to these developments reflected the complex relationship between revolutionary ideals and immediate practical needs. While Marie Claire and her neighbors were enthusiastic supporters of the general principle that working people deserved better living conditions, they were also acutely aware that any disruption to their current arrangements could leave them homeless. The garret accommodations were inadequate, but they were available and affordable. Any changes that made them unavailable without providing alternatives could easily worsen rather than improve their situations. The winter of 1790 brought these tensions into sharp focus. The revolutionary government had established various committees and commissions to address social problems, including housing conditions for the urban poor. But the actual implementation of reforms was slow and often bureaucratic, while the immediate needs of garret dwellers continued to require daily attention and creative solutions. Marie Claire found herself navigating between her growing political consciousness and her continuing need to maintain the practical accommodations that made her survival possible. The informal networks of mutual support that had always characterized garret life began to take on explicitly political dimensions during this period. The same neighbors who had shared water-carrying duties and child-care responsibilities now also shared information about political developments, discussed the implications of new laws and regulations, and organized to advocate for their interests with revolutionary authorities. These activities represented a significant expansion of political participation for people who had previously been excluded from formal political processes. The irony of the revolutionary period for garret dwellers was that their living conditions, which had always made them invisible to the broader society, now became a symbol of the social problems that the revolution was supposed to address. Political speakers and pamphlet writers began to use garret life as evidence of the injustices of the old regime, describing the daily struggles of rooftop communities as proof that fundamental changes were necessary. This attention was both validating and somewhat uncomfortable for people like Marie Claire, who found their private struggles becoming public political symbols. As Marie-Claire prepared for what would prove to be her last winter in the garret community of the Faubourg Saint-Antoine, she reflected on the changes that had transformed her life and her understanding of her place in society. The room itself remained the same 8 feet by 12 feet, cold, inadequately ventilated, reached by 5 flights of increasingly narrow stairs. But her relationship to that room and what it represented had been fundamentally altered by the political upheavals of the previous year. The revolution had not yet solved the practical problems of garret life, but it had created new possibilities for thinking about those problems and new venues for addressing them. Marie-Claire now understood that her living conditions were not simply the result of personal economic limitations, but were connected to larger social and political structures that could, in principle, be changed. Whether they would actually be changed, and whether such changes would improve life for people like her, remained open questions as she settled into her narrow bed and listened to the familiar sounds of her community, preparing for another night of uncertain rest in their aerial refuge above the revolutionary streets of Paris. The questions that would shape her dreams that night were no longer simply about personal survival, though those concerns remained urgent and immediate. Now she also wondered about collective possibilities, about whether the political transformation that was remaking France might also remake the fundamental conditions under which working people lived, and about what role she and her neighbors might play in determining the shape of that transformation. The revolution had come to the rooftops, but what it would mean for the people who lived there remained a story yet to be written. The first frost of 1788 arrived in the 3rd week of October, settling over the French countryside like a crystalline shroud that would not lift for nearly 6 months. For Pierre Lemoyne, a day laborer who worked the harvest fields around the village of Meaux, some 30 kilometers east of Paris, this early freeze marked the beginning of what would become known throughout the region as the winter that changed everything. Pierre lived with his wife Marguerite and their 3 children in a single room that measured roughly 12 feet by 14 feet, attached to a larger farmhouse owned by the local seigneur. The room had originally been designed as storage space for grain and farm implements, but the pressing need for housing among the rural poor had transformed it, like thousands of similar spaces throughout France, into a dwelling that sheltered a family of 5 through the changing seasons of their precarious existence. The walls of Pierre's home were constructed of fieldstone and clay mortar, materials that had been locally available and relatively inexpensive. When the building was erected some 40 years earlier, the mortar had aged poorly, developing cracks and gaps that allowed cold air to penetrate the interior with increasing efficiency as the years passed. During the summer months, these gaps actually provided beneficial ventilation, helping to prevent the stuffiness that could make small spaces uncomfortable. But as autumn progressed toward winter, the same openings that had provided relief from heat became channels for the bitter cold that would dominate their lives for the next half year. The floor of their dwelling was packed earth, originally smooth, and level but worn into an uneven surface by decades of foot traffic and the movement of furniture. During dry periods, the floor was reasonably comfortable, though it generated considerable dust when swept or when the children played. During wet weather, however, the earth floor became a source of persistent dampness that permeated everything in the room and created conditions that were both uncomfortable and unhealthy. The approaching winter promised to combine the worst aspects of both conditions: frozen ground that would conduct cold into the room while also creating condensation that would make their bedding and clothing perpetually damp, the family sleeping. Arrangements reflected both their economic constraints and the social customs of rural France. Pierre and Marguerite shared a bed that consisted of a wooden frame supporting a mattress made from canvas stuffed with straw and chaff from the previous year's harvest. The bed was elevated about 18 inches from the floor, partly to provide storage space underneath, and partly to minimize the cold that would radiate from the frozen ground during the winter months. Their 3 children, Mary, age 8, Jean, age 6, and baby Catherine, was not yet 2 years old, shared a smaller bed of similar, ermed construction that had been positioned against the wall opposite their parents' bed. The bedding for both. Beds consisted primarily of wool blankets that Marguerite had woven herself from yarn purchased from traveling merchants during more prosperous periods. These blankets were supplemented by a collection of quilts, coverlets, and other fabric items that had been acquired over the years through various means gifts from relatives, purchases at local markets, and items that Marguerite had sewn herself. From scraps of cloth obtained through her occasional work as a seamstress for wealthier families in the village, the room's single window faced south, which provided the advantage of receiving whatever sunlight was available during the short winter days, but also created the disadvantage of being positioned to receive the full force of the cold north winds that would sweep across the exposed countryside during the harshest months. The window itself was a simple wooden frame containing 6 small panes of glass, several of which had developed cracks that would need to be sealed with cloth or paper to prevent drafts. The wooden shutters that protected the window were thick and well fitted, but closing them completely would eliminate the room's only source of natural light, creating a dilemma that rural families faced throughout the winter months. Heating the room presented challenges that required both careful planning and constant attention. The family's primary heating source was a stone fireplace that had been built into one wall of the room when it was converted from storage space to living quarters. The fireplace was relatively small, designed more for basic heating than for the elaborate cooking that characterized the fireplaces of wealthier homes. The chimney, which shared its flue with the main fireplace in the farmhouse, sometimes drew poorly, filling the room with smoke when wind conditions were unfavorable. Fuel for the fireplace came from several sources, each requiring different forms of labor and planning. Wood was the preferred fuel, providing steady heat and relatively clean burning, but it was also the most expensive and difficult to obtain. Pierre was permitted to gather fallen branches from the woods that surrounded the village, but this source of fuel required considerable time and physical effort to collect, transport, and prepare for burning. The landowner occasionally provided wood as part of Pierre's compensation for farm work, but this arrangement was irregular and could not be depended upon throughout the winter. Alternative fuels included dried animal dung, which was abundant and free but produced less heat and considerable smoke, and peat, which could be dug from nearby marshes during the autumn months and provided reasonable heat, but required advanced preparation and storage. Marguerite had also experimented with burning dried corn stalks, straw, and other agricultural waste. But these materials burned quickly and required constant attention to maintain any useful level of heat. The family's food storage and preparation capabilities were shaped by the constraints of their single-room living arrangement and their limited economic resources. A wooden cabinet, constructed by Pierre during a period of unemployment 2 years earlier, held their supply of preserved foods, cooking utensils, and the few pieces of crockery they owned. The cabinet was positioned near the fireplace, where the warmth would help prevent their stored food from freezing during the coldest periods. Their food supply at the beginning of the winter consisted primarily of grain wheat, barley, and oats that Pierre had received as payment for harvest work, along with a small quantity of preserved vegetables from Marguerite's garden, some dried beans and peas, and a precious store of salt that would be essential for food preservation. Throughout the winter months, they had been unable to afford meat for preservation, though Pierre occasionally supplemented their diet by trapping rabbits or birds when opportunities presented themselves. The approach of winter in 1788 carried with it an atmosphere of particular dread that distinguished it from the ordinary seasonal anxiety that characterized rural life. The harvest had been poor throughout the region, damaged by the same unpredictable weather patterns that were now bringing early frost and the promise of a harsh winter. Pierre's work during the harvest season had been less steady than usual, and the payment he received had been reduced to reflect the disappointing crop yields that affected everyone in the agricultural economy. Marguerite's garden, which typically provided a significant supplement to their food supply, had also suffered from the adverse weather conditions. The vegetables she had managed to preserve were fewer in quantity and poorer in quality than in previous years, and she had been forced to use some of their stored grain to supplement their meals even before winter had properly begun. The calculation that occupied both their minds as the cold weather approached was whether their food supplies would last until spring, and what they would do if the answer proved to be no. The social dynamics of rural poverty created additional layers of complexity for families like Pierre's as they prepared for the challenging months ahead. The village of Meaux included families representing a range of economic circumstances, from prosperous farmers who owned substantial amounts of land to landless laborers like Spies, Pierre, who depended entirely on their ability to find work with other people. These economic differences translated into significant variations in winter preparedness and security. The wealthier farming families in the village had well-insulated stone houses with multiple rooms, separate kitchens, and storage areas that could accommodate substantial food supplies and fuel reserves. Their livestock provided not only economic security, but also additional heating for their homes and a reliable source of protein throughout the winter months. For these families, winter was a time of reduced activity and indoor pursuits, but not typically a period of genuine hardship or danger. For families like Pierre's, however, winter represented a 6-month period of survival that required careful management of limited resources and constant attention to the basic necessities of food, fuel, and shelter. The margin for error was minimal, and any unexpected expense or loss of income could quickly transform an already difficult situation into a genuine crisis. The awareness of this vulnerability created a persistent anxiety that colored every aspect of winter preparation and daily life. The community relationships that developed among the poorer families in the village reflected both mutual dependence and the competition for scarce resources that characterized their economic situation. Formal systems of mutual aid, organized through the church and local government, provided some assistance to families in extreme need. But these resources were limited and often insufficient to meet the demand. More important were the informal networks of cooperation and support that developed among neighbors who understood each other's struggles and were willing to share resources when possible. Pierre and Marguerite participated in several of these informal mutual aid arrangements. They shared childcare responsibilities with the Rousseau family, who lived in similar circumstances in a converted stable behind the church. When Pierre found work, he would sometimes share information about additional opportunities with other unemployed men in the village, understanding that their willingness to reciprocate might be crucial during his own periods without work. Marguerite participated in informal networks of women who shared resources for food preparation, childcare, and the various domestic tasks that were essential for family survival. These cooperative arrangements were based on trust and mutual understanding rather than formal agreements, and they required careful attention to maintain balanced reciprocity. Families who took more than they gave would find themselves excluded from these networks, while those who gave too generously might find themselves unable to meet their own needs. The social skills required to navigate these relationships successfully were as important as the physical skills needed for farming or domestic work. As October gave way to November, and the early frost was followed by increasingly severe cold, Pierre began to implement the survival strategies that experience had taught him during previous hard winters. The family's daily routine shifted to accommodate the shorter daylight hours and the need to conserve fuel and food. They began to eat their main meal earlier in the day, when sunlight streaming through their window could supplement the heat. From their fireplace, evening meals became simpler and were often consumed by firelight. To save on candles and lamp oil, the sleeping arrangements that had been comfortable during the warmer months required significant modification to provide adequate warmth during the cold period ahead. Pierre and Marguerite began bringing extra clothing to bed with them, wearing wool caps and multiple layers of clothing while sleeping to retain body heat. The children's sleeping arrangements were also modified, with all three children sharing the smaller bed to maximize the warming effect of their combined body heat. The family began experimenting with additional insulation techniques that they had heard about from other families or had read about in the agricultural pamphlets that sometimes circulated in the village. They stuffed straw and rags into the gaps between the stones in their walls, creating a crude but effective form of insulation. They hung heavy cloth over their window at night, reducing heat loss while still allowing them to open the shutters. During the day, for light, they even tried the technique of heating stones by the fire and then wrapping them in cloth to place at the foot of their beds, providing localized warmth that would last for several hours. The psychological preparation for winter was as important as the physical preparations, though it was less tangible and more difficult to plan systematically. Pierre and Marguerite both understood that the months ahead would test their endurance, their resourcefulness, and their ability to maintain hope and family cohesion under conditions of persistent stress and discomfort. They had survived previous hard winters, but each new winter brought its own unique challenges, and there was no guarantee that past success would predict future survival. The children's needs added additional complexity to the winter preparations. Marie and Jean were old enough to understand that the family faced difficulties. They were too young to fully comprehend the nature or extent of the challenges ahead. Maintaining their spirits and providing them with some sense of security and normalcy would require constant effort from both parents. Baby Catherine's needs were more immediate and less flexible. She required warmth, adequate nutrition, and protection from illness, regardless of the family's economic circumstances. As November progressed and the first significant snowfall covered the countryside around Meaux, Pierre found himself contemplating questions that had no easy answers. How long would their food supplies last if the winter proved to be as severe as it was beginning to appear? What would they do if he was unable to find any work during the winter months? How would they heat their room if they could not obtain adequate fuel? And most troubling of all, what would happen to his family if the changes that everyone seemed to sense coming to France made their already precarious situation even more unstable? These questions would haunt the long winter nights ahead, as Pierre and Marguerite lay in their bed listening to the wind whistle through the gaps in their walls and feeling the cold seep through their inadequate insulation. The winter of 1788 to 1789 was beginning to reveal itself as something more than just another season of hardship. Was becoming a test of survival that would challenge everything they had learned about endurance, resourcefulness, and the possibility of hope in the face of seemingly insurmountable difficulties. By the middle of December 1788, the winter that had begun with unusual early frost had developed into something unprecedented in the living memory of anyone in the village of Meaux. The cold was not simply severe, though temperatures had dropped far below anything Pierre Lemoyne and his neighbors had experienced, persistent in a way that seemed to challenge the natural order of seasonal change. Week after week, the frozen ground remained hard as stone. The wells in the village froze solid, and the Seine River, which had never completely frozen in Pierre's 34 years of life, became a solid sheet of ice thick enough to support the weight of loaded wagons. The transformation of the familiar landscape into an alien world of unrelenting cold had profound implications for every aspect of rural life. But its impact was most severe on families like Pierre's, who had entered the winter with minimal resources and no cushion of security to buffer them against unexpected hardships. What had been difficult living conditions became desperate ones, and what had been careful management of scarce resources became a daily struggle against the very real possibility of death from cold, hunger, or disease. The heating challenges that had seemed manageable during the early weeks of winter became critical as the temperature continued to drop. The small fireplace that had adequately warmed their single room during previous winters proved insufficient against the penetrating cold of this extraordinary season. Even with a fire burning continuously, the temperature in their room remained uncomfortably cold, and the areas furthest from the fireplace where the children's bed was positioned became nearly unbearable during the coldest hours of the night. Pierre's daily routine now centered entirely around the procurement and management of fuel for their fire. He would rise each morning before dawn, when the cold was at its most intense, to stoke the fire that had been banked the evening before. The process of getting a good fire started in the extremely cold conditions required careful attention and considerable skill. The wood, which had absorbed moisture from the humid air, would often resist ignition, requiring the use of precious kindling and sometimes small amounts of cooking oil. To establish a flame, the search for fuel had become an all-consuming occupation that took Pierre further and further from the village as nearby sources were exhausted. The fallen branches and dead wood that had been easily available in the local woods were quickly gathered by all the families in the area, creating a competition for resources that sometimes led to conflicts between neighbors who had previously maintained friendly relationships. Pierre found himself walking distances of 3 or 4 kilometers to find adequate wood, and the time required for these fuel-gathering expeditions reduced the time available for other essential activities. The physical demands of fuel gathering in the extreme cold were exhausting and potentially dangerous. Pierre would spend hours in the frozen woods, using whatever tools he could obtain to cut and break wood that had become brittle and difficult to work. His hands, even protected by the wool mittens that Marguerite had knitted for him, would become numb with cold, making it difficult to grip tools effectively and increasing the risk of injury. The return journey, carrying heavy loads of wood over snow-covered and increasingly treacherous terrain, tested his physical endurance to its limits. Alternative fuel sources became increasingly important as wood became scarce and difficult to obtain. Pierre and his neighbors began systematically collecting any combustible material they could find: dried corn stalks from the previous harvest, animal dung from farms throughout the area, even old furniture and wooden implements that could be sacrificed for fuel. Marguerite contributed to the fuel supply by carefully saving every scrap of combustible material from their daily activity: scraps of paper, cloth that was too worn to mend, even the husks from their grain preparation. The quality of these alternative fuels was generally poor compared to seasoned wood, requiring more frequent feeding of the fire and producing more smoke and less heat. The smoke was particularly problematic in their small, poorly ventilated room, creating conditions that made breathing difficult and irritated everyone's eyes and throats. The children, especially baby Catherine, began to develop persistent coughing that worried both parents and added to their growing sense of crisis. Food management during this period required even more careful attention than usual, as the extreme cold increased the family's caloric needs while simultaneously making food more difficult to prepare and preserve. The grain that formed the basis of their diet became difficult to grind when it was frozen, and cooking required more fuel than they could easily spare. Marguerite developed new techniques for food preparation that minimized fuel consumption, while still providing adequate nutrition for the family. One of these techniques involved cooking larger quantities of food less frequently, preparing enough grain-based porridge or soup to last for 2 or 3 days, and reheating smaller portions as needed. This approach reduced the total amount of fuel required for cooking, but it also created challenges for food preservation in their cold room. Food that was cooked and then allowed to cool would freeze solid, requiring careful thawing before it could be consumed. The family's water supply, which had always required daily trips to the village well, became increasingly problematic as the winter progressed. The well itself froze solid in early January, forcing all the villagers to melt snow for their water needs. The process of melting snow required significant amounts of fuel and produced water that was often cloudy and unpalatable. Moreover, the quantity of fuel required to melt adequate water for drinking, cooking, and basic hygiene competed directly with their heating needs, forcing difficult choices about how to allocate their limited resources. The clothing and bedding that had provided adequate warmth during normal winters proved insufficient against the extraordinary cold of 1788 to 1789. Pierre and Marguerite began wearing all of their clothing to bed, layering every available garment to create insulation against the cold that penetrated their inadequate shelter. The children's sleeping arrangements were modified repeatedly as their parents searched for ways to provide adequate warmth for small bodies that were particularly vulnerable to the effects of extreme cold. The technique of heating stones by the fire and placing them in the beds became a nightly ritual that required careful coordination between Pierre and Marguerite. Stones had to be heated long enough to provide warmth throughout the night, but not so long that they would burn through cloth or cause other damage. The process of wrapping heated stones and placing them safely in the beds required attention. That was difficult to provide when both parents were exhausted from the day's survival activities. Despite these efforts, the family's bedtime routine had become a complex exercise in layering, positioning, and heat conservation that often took an hour or more to complete properly. The children, who had previously looked forward to bedtime as a warm and comfortable end to their day, now dreaded the transition from the relative warmth near the fireplace to the cold that dominated the rest of their room. The social dynamics of the village began to change as the extreme winter conditions created new forms of hardship and desperation. The informal networks of mutual aid that had previously characterized relationships among the poorer families became strained as everyone's resources were stretched to their limits. Families that had previously been willing to share food, fuel, or labor began to hoard their resources, recognizing that their own survival might depend on careful conservation of everything they had at the same time. The shared experience of unprecedented hardship created new forms of cooperation and mutual support. Families began to combine resources for fuel gathering, organizing expeditions that could venture further from the village and gather larger quantities of wood than individual efforts could achieve. Some families experimented with combining their heating efforts, gathering in one room during the coldest parts of the day to share the warmth of a single fire. Pierre and Marguerite participated in one such arrangement with the Rousseau family and two other families from their immediate neighborhood. The 5 families would gather each evening in the largest available room, bringing their own food for a shared meal that was cooked over a single fire. The combined body heat of 20 people in one room, along with the warmth from the fire, created conditions that were genuinely comfortable for the first time since the extreme cold had begun. These shared evening gatherings became not only survival strategies, but also important social occasions that helped maintain morale during the darkest period of the winter. The adults would share information about fuel sources, food availability, and work opportunities, while the children could play together in warm conditions that had become rare in their individual homes. The conversations that took place during these gatherings often turned to larger questions about their circumstances and the changes that seemed to be occurring throughout France, the political upheavals that were beginning to transform French society seemed distant and abstract to families struggling with the immediate challenges of survival. But they also offered the possibility that fundamental changes might improve their circumstances. Pierre and his neighbors began to discuss ideas that had previously seemed impossible, that poor people might deserve better living conditions, that the social arrangements that kept them in poverty might be changed, that their hardships were not simply natural and inevitable, but might be the result of unfair systems that could be reformed. The physical effects of prolonged exposure to extreme cold began to manifest themselves in various health problems that affected all members of the family. Pierre developed chilblains on his hands and feet, painful swellings that made it difficult for him to work effectively during his fuel-gathering expeditions. Marguerite began experiencing persistent coughing and breathing difficulties that seemed to be related to the smoke and poor air quality in their room. The children all showed signs of nutritional deficiency and cold exposure that worried both parents. Baby Catherine's condition became particularly concerning as the winter progressed. At less than 2 years old, she was least able to regulate her body temperature and most vulnerable to the effects of cold and poor nutrition. She began to lose weight and showed signs of lethargy that suggested she was not receiving adequate nourishment. The family's food supplies, which had been carefully calculated to last through a normal winter, were being consumed more rapidly than expected due to the increased caloric needs created by the extreme cold. The medical resources available to rural families were extremely limited under the best of circumstances, and the harsh winter conditions made access to even basic medical care nearly impossible. The village had no resident physician, and the traveling practitioners who occasionally served the area had suspended their visits during the worst of the winter weather. Traditional folk remedies based on herbs and techniques passed down through generations represented the primary form of medical care available to families like Pierre's. Marguerite had some knowledge of traditional healing practices, learned from her mother and other women in the community. But many of the herbs and materials used in these remedies were unavailable during the winter months. She experimented with treatments that could be prepared from materials. They had available hot compresses for Pierre's chilblains, steam treatments for the respiratory problems that were affecting the entire family, and various preparations designed to improve nutrition and boost resistance to illness. The psychological strain of prolonged exposure to extreme conditions began to affect all members of the family in different ways. Pierre, who had previously been able to maintain optimism even during difficult periods, began to show signs of depression and hopelessness that worried Marguerite. The constant struggle to provide adequate fuel and food, combined with the persistent cold and the health problems affecting his family, seemed to be wearing away his resilience and determination. Marguerite found herself taking on increased responsibility for maintaining family morale and managing the daily activities that were essential for survival. In addition to her traditional roles in food preparation and childcare, she became the family's primary strategist for resource management and the emotional anchor who helped everyone maintain hope during the darkest periods of the winter. The children's responses to the prolonged hardship varied according to their ages and personalities. Marie, the oldest at 8, began to understand the seriousness of their situation and tried to help with various tasks. But she also showed signs of anxiety and fearfulness that had not previously characterized her behavior. Jean, at 6, was more focused on the immediate discomforts of cold and hunger, becoming cranky and difficult to manage during the periods when conditions were worst. Baby Catherine's needs remained the most immediate and inflexible, requiring constant attention despite the family's limited resources. As February arrived with no sign of improvement in the weather conditions, Pierre began to confront the possibility that their survival might require choices and sacrifices that he had never imagined having to make. Their food supplies were running dangerously low, their fuel reserves were nearly exhausted, and the health problems affecting the family seemed to be getting worse rather than better. The question that had haunted him since the beginning of the winter whether they would survive until spring was becoming more urgent with each passing day. The community around them was facing similar challenges, with some families already abandoning their homes to seek shelter with relatives in other areas or to beg for assistance from charitable institutions in larger towns. The social fabric that had held the village together was beginning to fray under the pressure of conditions that exceeded everyone's capacity to cope using traditional survival strategies, but even as the immediate situation became more desperate, Pierre found himself thinking about larger questions that the winter's hardships had brought into focus. Why did families like his have to live in conditions that made survival so precarious? What would it mean if the political changes that were being discussed throughout France actually resulted in better living conditions for working people? And what role might he and his neighbors play in bringing about changes that could prevent future winters from becoming battles for survival? These questions would sustain him through the remaining weeks of what was proving to be the most challenging winter of his life, as he and his family faced the ultimate test of their endurance, resourcefulness, and commitment to each other in the face of conditions that seemed designed to break the human spirit. March 1789 arrived in the village of Meaux, not with the gradual warming and renewal that typically marked the transition from winter to spring, but with a continuation of the bitter cold that had dominated the previous 5 months for Pierre Lemoyne and his family, who had survived the worst winter in living memory through a combination of determination, resourcefulness, and increasingly desperate measures. The persistence of freezing temperatures into what should have been the season of recovery represented a crisis that threatened to overwhelm their depleted reserves of strength, resources, and hope. The food situation had become critical by early March. The grain supplies that Pierre had carefully calculated to last through a normal winter had been exhausted 2 weeks earlier, forcing the family to depend on whatever resources they could obtain through begging, borrowing, or the increasingly rare opportunities for Pierre to find work. Marguerite's preserved vegetables had been consumed weeks ago, and even the emergency supplies that she had hidden away for the direst circumstances were now gone. The family's daily routine had become a constant search for any source of nutrition that could keep them alive until conditions improved. Pierre would leave their room each morning before dawn, not to gather fuel, as had been his primary occupation during the earlier months of winter, but to search for food from any source that might be available. This search took him to neighboring villages, to farms where he might find work in exchange for meals, and even to the refuse areas behind the houses of more prosperous families, where he might find scraps that could be converted into something edible. The social dynamics of hunger had transformed the relationships among the village's poorer families in ways that were both predictable and heartbreaking. The networks of mutual aid that had provided essential support during the early months of winter had largely collapsed as every family focused on their own survival. Neighbors who had previously shared resources now guarded their remaining supplies jealously, understanding that any generosity might mean the difference between life and death for their own families. Yet even in these desperate circumstances, new forms of cooperation and solidarity began to emerge. Families that had nothing left to share began to share information about where food might be obtained, about work opportunities, about which of the more prosperous households might be willing to provide charity. This information sharing represented a form of mutual aid that required no material resources but could be life-saving for families who were running out of options. Pierre's fuel-gathering activities had also reached a point of crisis. The easily accessible wood sources within walking distance of the village had been exhausted months earlier, and the alternative fuels that had sustained his family through the worst of the winter were also becoming difficult to obtain. Other families in similar circumstances were competing for the same resources, and the physical demands of traveling longer distances in search of fuel were becoming difficult to manage on the reduced nutrition that characterized their current diet. The heating situation in their room had deteriorated to the point where maintaining any useful level of warmth required almost constant attention. The small fireplace that had once provided adequate heat for their space now struggled to warm even the immediate area around the hearth. The gaps in their walls, which had been imperfectly sealed with straw and rags earlier in the winter, had developed new openings as the building materials shifted and settled under the stress of the prolonged freeze. The family's sleeping arrangements had been modified repeatedly as they searched for ways to conserve body heat and share their inadequate blankets and clothing. All 5 family members now slept in the single larger bed, with the adults on the outside and the 3 children in the middle, creating a configuration that maximized the warming effect of shared body heat. Even this arrangement provided only marginal comfort, and the family would often spend much of the night awake, adjusting positions and rearranging coverings in a continuous effort to maintain tolerable sleeping conditions. The health problems that had begun to affect the family during the worst of the winter had become more serious as their nutritional status declined and their exposure to cold and poor air quality continued. Pierre's chilblains had developed into open sores that made walking painful and increased his vulnerability to infection. Marguerite's respiratory problems had worsened to the point where she experienced difficulty breathing even when resting, and her persistent coughing often kept the entire family awake. The children's condition was particularly concerning to both parents. Marie, who had been energetic and curious before the winter began, had become listless and showed little interest in activities that had previously engaged her attention. Jean had developed a persistent cough similar to his mother's, and both older children showed obvious signs of weight loss and malnutrition. Baby Catherine's condition was most alarming. She had become increasingly passive and unresponsive, showing little interest in food or play, and sleeping much more than was normal for a child her age. The medical resources that might have provided help for these health problems remained as inaccessible as they had been throughout the winter. The few folk remedies that Marguerite had been able to prepare from available materials had provided little relief, and some traditional treatments required herbs or other materials that were simply unavailable during the prolonged winter. The family's declining nutritional status made them more vulnerable to illness, while simultaneously reducing their capacity to recover from health problems. The psychological effects of prolonged hardship had begun to manifest themselves in ways that affected the family's ability to function effectively. Pierre, who had maintained his determination and optimism through the worst of the winter, began to show signs of despair that worried Marguerite and affected his ability to make the daily efforts that were essential for their survival. There were mornings when he would lie in bed after waking, seemingly unable to summon the energy and motivation needed to begin another day of searching for food and fuel. Marguerite found herself carrying an increasingly heavy burden of responsibility for maintaining family functioning and morale, in addition to managing their limited resources and caring for the children. She became the primary source of emotional support and encouragement for all family members. This role required reserves of strength and optimism that were becoming more difficult to maintain as her own physical and emotional resources were depleted by the prolonged stress. The children's psychological adaptation to their circumstances varied according to their developmental stages and individual temperaments. Marie, as the oldest, had begun to understand the gravity of their situation and showed signs of anxiety and fearfulness that had not previously been part of her personality. She had also begun to take on responsibilities that were normally handled by adults, helping with food preparation, childcare, and even some aspects of resource management. Jean's response to the hardship was more focused on immediate physical discomforts and needs. He complained frequently about being cold and hungry, and his behavior became more difficult to manage as the stress of their circumstances affected his ability to follow instructions and cooperate with family routines. Baby Catherine's needs remained immediate and inflexible, but her capacity to communicate those needs had declined as her overall health and energy level deteriorated. The broader community context in which the family was struggling had also undergone significant changes during the winter months. Several families had already abandoned their homes in the village, either relocating to other areas where they hoped to find better opportunities, or moving to larger towns where charitable institutions might provide assistance. The village's population had declined noticeably, and the social institutions that had previously provided some stability and support were functioning poorly or had ceased to operate entirely. The local church, which had traditionally provided both spiritual comfort and practical assistance to families in need, was struggling with its own resource limitations. The priest, who had previously been able to provide food and fuel to the Most desperate families found that the demands for assistance far exceeded the church's capacity to respond. The informal charitable network that had connected more prosperous families with their poorer neighbors had also been strained beyond its capacity to function effectively. Yet, even as traditional sources of assistance failed, new forms of mutual aid and social organization began to emerge in response to the crisis. Groups of families began to coordinate their survival efforts, sharing information and resources in ways that went beyond the individual family networks that had previously characterized village social organization. These emerging forms of cooperation were often temporary and informal, but they represented creative adaptations too, circumstances that exceeded the capacity of traditional social structures to address. Pierre found himself participating in several of these informal cooperation arrangements. A group of men from the village began to coordinate their fuel-gathering expeditions, traveling together to more distant locations where they could obtain wood and other combustible materials that were no longer available locally. This cooperation allowed them to venture further than would have been safe for individuals, and the shared labor made it possible to gather larger quantities of fuel than any single person could manage alone. Similarly, the women in the village began to coordinate their food preparation activities, sharing the labor of cooking and the resources of fuel in ways that made more efficient use of both. Marguerite participated in arrangements where several families would take turns providing cooking facilities and fuel, while all the participating families would contribute whatever food ingredients they had available. These shared meals were often meager, but they provided better nutrition than any individual family could manage with their limited resources. The political discussions that had begun during the early months of winter continued to evolve as the crisis deepened, and traditional authority structures proved inadequate to address the community's needs. The conversations that took place during shared meals and work expeditions often focused on questions about why such hardships were necessary, whether the social arrangements that created such vulnerability were fair or natural, and what changes might prevent similar crises in the future. Pierre and his neighbors began to hear reports about political developments in other parts of France, discussions of new forms of government, debates about the rights of common people, and proposals for changes that might improve the circumstances of families like theirs. These reports were often fragmentary and contradictory, filtered through multiple layers of retelling and interpretation. But they suggested that the winter's hardships were part of a larger crisis that was affecting the entire country. The possibility that political change might offer solutions to their immediate problems provided a source of hope that helped sustain the community through the darkest period of their crisis. Even if the specific mechanisms of such change were unclear, the idea that their suffering was not simply natural and inevitable, but might be addressed through human action provided psychological resources that were as important as the material resources they struggled to obtain. As March progressed and the extreme cold finally began to show signs of moderation, Pierre and his neighbors found themselves contemplating not only immediate survival, but also the longer-term implications of what they had experienced. The winter of 1788 to 1789 had tested every assumption about rural life, community, organization, and individual endurance. It had demonstrated both the vulnerability of traditional survival strategies and the possibility of new forms of cooperation and mutual aid. The gradual warming that finally arrived in the last week of March came not as the joyful celebration of spring that typically marked the end of winter, but as a relief so profound that it was difficult to trust or fully embrace. Pierre and his family had survived, but they had been changed by the experience in ways that would affect the rest of their lives. They had learned things about hunger, cold, desperation that could never be unlearned. But they had also discovered resources of endurance and mutual support that they had not known they possessed. The spring of 1789 would bring new challenges. As Pierre and his neighbors attempted to rebuild their lives and prepare for the future, The political upheavals that were transforming France would offer new possibilities for addressing the problems that the winter had revealed. But they would also create new uncertainties and risks. The questions that would shape their future were no longer simply about surviving the next winter, but about what kind of society might emerge from the crisis they had endured, and what role they might play in shaping that transformation. As Pierre stood in the doorway of their small room, watching the first signs of spring begin to transform the landscape that had been frozen and barren for so many months, he found himself thinking not only about the immediate tasks of recovery and preparation for the next agricultural season, but about the larger questions of justice, security, and human dignity that the winter's hardships had brought into such sharp focus. The spring that had almost never come was finally arriving, but the world it was revealing would prove to be fundamentally different from the one that had existed before the winter that changed everything. In the village of St. Paul de Leon, nestled among the windswept fields of Brittany, where the Atlantic winds carried the salt smell of the sea across ancient stone farmhouses, the rhythm of daily life moved to the cadence of a tradition that stretched back through centuries of rural French existence. Here, in the solid stone cottages that dotted the landscape like weathered monuments to endurance, families had for generations found their rest within the carved wooden embrace of box beds and closed sleeping chambers that were as much furniture as architecture, as much tradition as necessity. The Corey family's cottage, like most in the village, consisted of a single large room that served as kitchen, dining area, workshop, and social space, with an adjoining smaller room that housed their most precious possessions, 3 box beds that had been crafted by Louis, Corey's grandfather, nearly 60 years earlier. These beds, carved from local oak and fitted with doors that could seal their occupants in complete darkness, represented not just sleeping accommodations, but a form of domestic architecture that had evolved over centuries to address the specific challenges of rural life in a region where winter winds could drive rain through stone walls and where privacy was a luxury that required creative solutions. Louis Corey, a tenant farmer who worked 40 acres of land belonging to the local seigneur, lived in the cottage with his wife Anne, their 4 children ranging in age from 6 to 16, and his elderly mother, Marie, whose increasing frailty had made her a permanent resident of the smallest and most carefully positioned box bed. The arrangement of sleeping accommodations in the cottage reflected both practical necessities and the social hierarchies that governed rural family life, with each box bed serving not only as a sleeping space, but as a private domain within the shared domestic environment. The largest box bed, positioned against the wall adjacent to the main fireplace, belonged to Louis and Anne. This bed measured approximately 6 feet in length, 4 feet in width, and 4.5 feet in height, creating an enclosed space that was large enough for 2 adults to sleep comfortably while small enough to retain body heat effectively during the cold months. The bed was elevated 18 inches from the floor, partly to provide storage space underneath and partly to protect its occupants from drafts and dampness that might affect floor-level sleeping arrangements. The craftsmanship that had gone into the construction of this box bed reflected the skills and aesthetic sensibilities of rural Breton woodworkers. The oak panels that formed the walls were joined with traditional mortise and tenon construction that had remained solid and tight despite decades of use. The front of the bed featured 2 doors that could be latched from the inside, creating complete enclosure for the occupants. These doors were decorated with carved panels that depicted traditional Breton motif Celtic knots, stylized representations of local plants and animals, and geometric patterns that reflected the region's ancient artistic traditions. The interior of the box bed was lined with panels of lighter wood that had been carefully finished to provide a smooth, comfortable surface. A small window, no more than 8 inches square, had been cut into the back wall of the bed to provide ventilation and a minimal amount of light. This window could be closed with a sliding wooden panel during the coldest weather, allowing the occupants to balance their needs for fresh, air against their desire for warmth and comfort. The bed's mattress was a canvas sack filled with a mixture of straw, dried heather, and sheep's wool that Anne refreshed each autumn after the harvest. The combination of materials provided both comfort and insulation, with the straw providing structure, the heather adding a pleasant fragrance that was believed to have beneficial health effects, and the wool creating a layer of insulation that helped retain body heat. The mattress was covered with linen sheets that Anne had woven herself, and the bed was furnished with wool blankets and a coverlet that had been embroidered by Louis's mother during her younger years. The children's box bed, positioned against the opposite wall of the room, was slightly larger than their parents' bed, but was designed to accommodate for occupants. This bed measured 7 feet in length and 5 feet in width, with a height of 4 feet that made it comfortable for children but would have been cramped for adults. The internal arrangement of this bed reflected the ages and relationships of the Corey children, with the 2 oldest, Jean-Marie 16 and Marie-Louise 14, sleeping at one end, while the 2 younger children, Omri 10 and little Pierre 6, occupied the other end. The children's bed had been modified over the years to accommodate changing family needs. Originally constructed as a single sleeping space, it had been fitted with a removable wooden partition that could divide it into 2 separate compartments when privacy was desired or when the children's different sleep schedules made sharing difficult. The partition could be removed completely during the coldest weather, allowing all 4 children to share body heat more effectively. The decoration of the children's bed was less elaborate than their parents', but it reflected the same traditional craftsmanship and attention to detail. The doors featured simple carved panels with geometric designs, and the interior had been painted with a whitewash that helped brighten the enclosed space. Small shelves had been built into the interior walls to hold the children's few personal possessions, prayer books, simple toys carved from wood, and the clothes that were not currently being worn. The third box bed, positioned in a corner of the room where it would receive maximum protection from drafts, belonged to Louise's mother, Marie, who at 72 years of age had reached the stage of life where comfort and warmth took precedence over all other considerations. This bed was the smallest of the 3, measuring only 5.5 feet in length and 3.5 feet in width. But it was also the most carefully crafted and extensively modified to meet the specific needs of an elderly occupant. The grandmother's bed featured a small door that opened near the foot of the bed, allowing her to enter and exit without having to crawl the full length of the sleeping space. This door had been added by Louis several years earlier, when his mother's increasing arthritis made it difficult for her to maneuver in the confined space. The bed also featured additional insulation in the form of extra wood panels and sheets, wool stuffing that had been installed between the inner and outer walls. The interior of Marie's bed had been furnished with particular attention to comfort and convenience. A small shelf near her head held her prayer book, a rosary, and a pottery cup for water. A larger shelf near her feet held extra blankets and clothing that could be added or removed as her comfort required. The mattress had been made especially soft with additional layers of wool and down that had been saved over many years from the family's geese and chickens. The daily routine of the Corey family was organized around the rhythm of agricultural work and domestic activities, but it was also shaped by the unique characteristics of box bed sleeping arrangements. The evening ritual of preparing for sleep began shortly after the evening meal, when the family would gather around the main fireplace for prayers, conversation, and the various domestic tasks that were typically performed during the hours between supper and bedtime. The children's bedtime routine was overseen by their mother, Anne, who would help them prepare for sleep and ensure that their box bed was properly arranged for the night ahead. This preparation involved checking that the mattress and bedding were properly positioned, that any clothing to be worn during sleep was readily available, and that the small personal items that each child kept in the bed were safely stored. Anne would also check the ventilation arrangements, ensuring that the small window in the back of the bed was properly adjusted for the temperature, and weather conditions expected during the night. The process of entering the box bed required a specific technique that the children had learned through years of practice. The bed was entered through the front doors, which opened to reveal the full width of the sleeping space. Each child would climb into the bed feet first, sliding back, until they reached their designated sleeping area. The arrangement within the bed followed a pattern that had been established through negotiation and parental authority, with the older children positioned near the doors where they could exit, if necessary, without disturbing the younger ones. Once all 4 children were positioned in the bed, Anne would close the doors and latch them from the outside, creating the complete enclosure that was one of the distinctive features of box bed sleeping. The latch could be opened from the inside if necessary, but under normal circumstances, the bed would remain closed throughout the night, creating a warm, dark, and secure sleeping environment that was separate from the activities and disturbances of the main room. The parents' bedtime routine was similar but more elaborate, reflecting both their adult status and their responsibility for managing the household's nighttime security and comfort. Louis would bank the main fireplace, ensuring that enough coals remained to provide warmth throughout the night and to facilitate the morning fire-starting routine. He would also check the cottage's door and windows, making sure that the building was secure against both weather and potential intruders. Anne's evening responsibilities included checking on her mother-in-law, helping the elderly woman prepare for sleep, and ensuring that her bed was properly arranged for comfort and warmth. This assistance often included heating stones by the fire and wrapping them in cloth to place in Marie's bed, providing localized warmth that would help her sleep comfortably despite the arthritis that made cold weather particularly painful for her. The experience of sleeping within a box bed was unlike any other form of accommodation that speaked it in rural France during this period. Once the doors were closed and latched, the occupants found themselves in a completely enclosed space that was dark, quiet, and remarkably warm. The combination of body heat and the insulating properties of the wooden walls created a microclimate that was significantly warmer than the temperature of the surrounding room. Even during the coldest winter nights, the psychological effects of sleeping in such an enclosed space varied among different family members and took some adjustment for those not accustomed to the arrangement. The complete darkness could be comforting for those who preferred to sleep without any light, but it could also be disorienting for individuals who needed visual reference points to feel secure. The enclosed nature of the space provided a sense of privacy and security that was particularly valued in households where multiple generations shared living space. But it could also create feelings of confinement for those who preferred more open sleeping arrangements. The acoustic properties of the box beds provided both advantages and disadvantages for their occupants. The thick wooden walls effectively blocked most sounds from the main room, allowing occupants to sleep without being disturbed by conversations, domestic activities, or the sounds of other family members moving about. However, the enclosed space also amplified sounds made within the bed, making it difficult for multiple occupants to avoid disturbing each other during the night. The ventilation arrangements in the box beds required careful management to balance the need for fresh air against the desire to maintain warmth. Each bed was equipped with small openings that could be adjusted according to weather conditions and the preferences of the occupants. During mild weather, these openings would be left fully open to provide maximum air circulation. During cold weather, they might be partially closed to retain heat while still allowing adequate ventilation to prevent the air from becoming stale or dangerous. The maintenance and care of the box beds was an ongoing responsibility that required attention from all adult members of the household. The wooden surfaces needed periodic cleaning and occasional treatment with oil or wax to maintain their appearance and protect them from moisture damage. The mattresses required regular refreshing of their straw and organic filling, and the bedding needed washing and repair as it wore out from regular use. The storage capabilities of the box beds were almost as important as their sleeping functions in the context of rural households, where space was limited and possessions needed to be protected from moisture, rodents, and other threats. Underneath each bed provided secure storage for clothing, linens, and other valuable items that needed to be kept clean and dry. Small compartments and shelves built into the walls of the beds held personal items, medicines, and other objects that needed to be readily accessible to the beds. Occupants thought the social dynamics created by box bed sleeping arrangements reflected the broader patterns of family organization and authority that characterized rural French society. The assignment of beds and sleeping positions within beds was determined by age, gender, marital status, and family hierarchy, with the arrangements serving to reinforce social relationships and family structure. Changes in sleeping arrangements often marked important transitions in family members' lives: marriage, the birth of children, changes in health or economic status, or the death of family members. The seasonal variations in box bed usage reflected the changing needs and circumstances of rural life throughout the year. During the winter months, the beds were used for their maximum capacity, with all available space occupied and the doors kept closed throughout the night to maintain warmth. During the summer months, the beds might be used with doors open, or even with some occupants choosing to sleep outside the beds, when weather conditions made the enclosed spaces uncomfortably warm. The box bed communities that developed in villages like St. Paul de Leon represented a distinctive form of rural social organization that was shaped by both practical necessities and cultural traditions. Families throughout the village shared similar sleeping arrangements, creating common experiences and mutual understanding about the challenges and benefits of box bed life. The shared traditions of box bed construction, maintenance, and usage created bonds among community members and provided a framework for cooperation and mutual assistance. As Louis Corey settled into his box bed on a cold November evening in 1788, listening to the familiar sounds of his family preparing for sleep around him, he could not have known that the traditional way of life that the box beds represented was about to be challenged by forces that would transform French society. The political upheavals that were beginning to reshape the country would bring new ideas about individual rights, family organization, and domestic arrangements that would ultimately make the enclosed, communal sleeping arrangements of box bed communities seem outdated and restrictive. But for now, as he pulled the wooden doors closed and settled into the warm darkness that had embraced generations of his ancestors, Louis found himself contemplating the eternal questions that had occupied rural families for centuries. Would the next harvest be sufficient to sustain them through another winter? Would his children find opportunities for better lives than he had been able to achieve? And would the traditions that had provided security and comfort for so many generations continue to serve his family's needs in the uncertain times that seemed to lie ahead? The approach of winter in the village of St. Paul de Leon brought with it a transformation in the daily rhythms of the Corey family that extended far beyond the simple necessity of staying warm. As the days grew shorter and the Atlantic winds began to carry the first hints of the bitter cold that would dominate the months ahead, the box bed communities of rural Brittany entered into a seasonal ritual of preparation, adaptation, and mutual dependence that had been refined over generations of hard experience with the challenges of surviving harsh weather in marginal economic circumstances. The process of preparing the box beds for winter involved a complex set of activities that engaged every member of the household and required careful coordination of resources, labor, and planning. Anne Corey began her winter preparations in early October, when the first sharp frosts warned of the more severe weather to come. Her initial task was the complete renovation of the mattresses that provided the foundation for comfortable and warm sleeping throughout the cold months ahead. The straw that formed the base layer of each mattress had to be completely replaced with fresh material from the recently completed harvest. This task required Anne to sort through the available straw carefully, selecting only the finest, driest stalks that would provide both comfort and durability throughout the winter. The old straw, which had become compressed and dusty over the course of the previous year, was removed from the canvas mattress covers and added to the family supply of kindling and fire-starting material, the heather that formed the middle layer of the mattresses required a different kind of attention. Unlike straw, which was readily available from the farm's grain production, heather had to be gathered from the wild moorlands that surrounded the village. This gathering was traditionally a family activity that involved all members of the household who were old enough to walk the sometimes treacherous terrain where the best heather grew. The heather gathering expeditions were also social occasions that brought together families from throughout the village. Groups of women and children would venture onto the moors together, sharing the labor of cutting and bundling the aromatic plants while also sharing news, gossip, and the informal knowledge that was essential for managing rural households. These expeditions often lasted entire days, with participants bringing simple meals that were shared among the group and returning home in the evening with carts loaded with the purple-flowered plants that would provide both comfort and a pleasant fragrance to their sleeping arrangements. The wool that formed the top layer of the mattresses came from the family's small flock of sheep, which provided not only wool for bedding, but also occasional meat and milk products that supplemented their primarily agricultural diet. The preparation of wool for mattress use was a time-consuming process that required careful washing, combing, and treatment to remove lanolin and other substances that might attract insects or create unpleasant odors in the confined space of the box beds. Anne had learned the techniques of wool preparation from her mother and mother-in-law, and she took considerable pride in producing wool batting that was soft, clean, and long-lasting. The process began with washing the raw wool in heated water that had been softened with ash from the household fires. The wool was then repeatedly rinsed and dried, with each step designed to remove impurities while preserving the natural oils that would help repel moisture and maintain the wool's insulating properties. The reconstruction of the mattresses was a family activity that took place over several days in late October, when the weather was still mild enough to work comfortably, but cold enough to make the need for warm bedding apparent. Louis would help with the heavy lifting and positioning of the mattresses, while the children participated by helping to stuff the canvas covers with the various materials and by learning the techniques they would need to maintain their own bedding. When they established their own households, the process of filling the mattresses required careful attention to achieving the right density and distribution of materials. Too much filling would make the mattresses uncomfortable and difficult to conform to the sleeper's body. Too little filling would provide inadequate comfort and insulation. The materials also had to be distributed evenly throughout the mattress to prevent lumps and hollow spots that would create discomfort during sleep. In addition to renovating the mattresses, winter preparation involved a thorough inspection and maintenance of the box beds themselves. Louis would examine each bed carefully, looking for signs of wear, damage, or deterioration that might affect their performance during the challenging months ahead. Loose joints were tightened, worn or damaged wood was repaired or replaced, and all moving part stores, latches, and sliding panels were cleaned and lubricated to ensure smooth operation throughout the winter. The ventilation systems that were built into each box bed required particular attention during the winter preparation process. The small windows and air passages that provided fresh air to the enclosed sleeping spaces had to be cleaned of any accumulated debris and checked to ensure that they could be properly adjusted for different weather conditions. Louis would also inspect the areas around these openings to ensure that they were properly sealed against drafts while still allowing adequate air circulation. The heating arrangements for the box beds required both physical preparation and the accumulation of adequate fuel supplies for the winter months ahead. Each bed was designed to retain and concentrate the body heat of its occupants, but additional heating was sometimes necessary during the coldest periods. Louis and his sons began gathering firewood in early autumn, cutting and splitting logs. that would be stored in the cottages would shed and seasoned for optimal burning throughout the winter. The family also prepared alternative heating materials that could be used inside the box beds when necessary. Smooth stones from the fields were collected and stored near the main fireplace, where they could be heated and then wrapped in cloth to provide localized warmth within the beds. Iron implements farm tools that were not needed during the winter were also designated for heating purposes, as their metal construction allowed them to retain heat longer than stones, while being less likely to crack or break when exposed to extreme temperature changes. The bedding that would be used throughout the winter required its own extensive preparation process. The linen sheets that Anne had woven during the previous winter were carefully inspected, washed, and mended as necessary. Wool blankets were cleaned, re-dyed if their colors had faded, and repaired where wear had created holes or thin spots. The coverlets and quilts that provided the top layer of bedding were thoroughly aired, cleaned, and stored in preparation for their winter use, and also spent considerable time during the autumn months creating additional bedding items that would be needed during the coldest periods. She knitted wool caps for each family member, designed to be worn during sleep to prevent the loss of body heat through the head. She also created wool socks and mittens that could be worn to bed during the most severe weather, and she prepared additional blankets from any available wool that had not been used for mattress construction. The preparation of winter clothing that would be worn during sleep required different considerations than the preparation of clothing for daytime wear. Night clothes had to be warm and comfortable, but also durable enough to withstand the wear that came from sleeping in the confined spaces of the box beds. Anne created or modified shirts, shifts, and undergarments that were specifically designed for sleeping, with features like reinforced seams, smooth surfaces that would not create discomfort when lying down, and fastenings that would not create pressure points during sleep. The storage systems that were built into around the box beds also required preparation for the winter months. The spaces underneath the beds had to be cleaned and organized to accommodate the additional clothing, bedding, and personal items that would be needed during the cold season. The small shelves and compartments inside the beds were stocked with items that might be needed during the night medications, chamber pots, extra clothing, and small amounts of food for emergencies. The social preparations for winter in the box bed communities involved the establishment of mutual aid networks and cooperative arrangements that would help families survive the challenging months, when agricultural work was impossible and resources were most scarce. The Corey family participated in several informal agreements with their neighbors, sharing resources and labor in ways that benefited all participants while reducing the risks faced by individual families. One such arrangement involved the coordinated preparation of preserved foods that would supplement each family's diet during the winter months. The women of the village would work together to prepare large quantities of sauerkraut, pickled vegetables, and preserved meats, with each family contributing labor and raw materials, according to their ability and receiving preserved foods according to their needs. This cooperation allowed for more efficient use of preservation materials and equipment, while also ensuring that all families had access to some variety in their winter diet. The men of the village participated in similar cooperative arrangements for fuel gathering and winter construction projects. Groups of neighbors would work together to cut firewood in the forests that belonged to the local seigneur, with each family receiving a share of the wood proportional to the labor they had contributed. These work parties were not only more efficient than individual efforts, but also safer, as the shared labor reduced the risk of accidents and provided assistance when emergencies occurred. The winter preparation process also involved the establishment of informal schedules and protocols for the use of shared community resources. The village's mill, bakery, and other essential services operated on reduced schedules during the winter months, and families had to coordinate their use of these facilities to ensure that everyone's needs were met. The Corey family's weekly routine was planned around these community schedules, with specific days designated for grinding grain, baking bread, and other activities that required access to shared equipment and facilities. The psychological preparation for winter was as important as the physical preparations, though it was less tangible and more difficult to plan systematically. The members of the Corey family, like their neighbors throughout the village, understood that the months ahead would test their endurance, their resourcefulness, and their ability to maintain family harmony under conditions of confinement and stress. The box bed communities had developed various traditions and practices designed to help families cope with the psychological challenges of winter isolation. One such tradition involved the evening storytelling sessions that took place in many households during the winter months. After the family had gathered around the main fireplace for their evening meal and before they retired to their box beds for the night, Louis or Anne would tell stories that had been passed down through generations. Of rural families, these stories served multiple purposes. They provided entertainment during the long evening hours. They transmitted cultural values and historical knowledge to the children. And they created shared experiences that helped bind the family together. During the difficult winter months, the preparation of materials for these storytelling sessions required its own form of planning and organization. Louis and Anne would review the traditional stories they knew, sometimes consulting with older community members to refresh their memories of details or variations. They would also prepare simple props or visual aids that could enhance the storytelling experience: carved wooden figures, illustrated books or pamphlets, and small musical instruments that could provide background music or sound effects. The selection of stories for winter telling was influenced by both entertainment value and educational purpose. Tales of heroic endurance and survival were popular because they provided inspiration and models for coping with hardship. Stories that emphasized the importance of family cooperation and mutual aid reinforced the values that were essential for successful winter survival. Religious stories provided spiritual comfort and helped maintain the family's connection to the broader Catholic community of which they were part. As the first significant snowfall of the winter began to fall on a December evening in 1788, the Corey family gathered around their fireplace for what had become their nightly ritual of preparation for sleep in their box bed community. The cottage was warm and comfortable, filled with the familiar sounds and smells that marked the successful completion of their winter preparations. The box beds stood ready to provide secure and comfortable shelter through the months ahead, each one a small wooden fortress designed to protect its occupants from the cold that would soon dominate their lives. Anne moved through the cottage, checking on each family member and ensuring that everyone was prepared for the night ahead. She helped her mother-in-law arrange her bedding and positioned heated stones in the elderly woman's bed to provide additional warmth for her arthritic joints. She supervised the children's bedtime routine, making sure that each one had the appropriate clothing and personal items for a comfortable night's sleep in their shared box bed. Louis completed his evening security routine, banking the main fire and checking the cottage's doors and windows. He also prepared the materials that would be needed for the morning fire starting routine, arranging kindling and fuel in the pattern that would allow him to quickly restore warmth to the cottage when he arose before dawn. These evening preparations had become so routine that they required little conscious thought, but they represented the accumulated wisdom of generations of rural families who had learned through hard experience what was necessary for comfortable and safe winter survival. As each family member settled into their box bed and pulled the wooden doors closed behind them, they entered into the warm, dark embrace that would shelter them through another night of winter cold. The box beds created individual worlds within the shared domestic space, providing privacy and comfort while still maintaining the family connections that were essential for both practical and social support. The sounds of the family settling into sleep, the rustling of bedding, the quiet conversations between parents and children, the closing of box bed doors marked the end of another day in the seasonal rhythm that governed rural life. These sounds were familiar and comforting, representing the successful continuation of traditions that had sustained rural families through countless winters of hardship and uncertainty. But as Louis lay in his box bed, listening to the wind begin to howl around the cottage and feeling the first cold drafts that warned of the severe weather to come, he found himself wondering whether the traditional ways of life that the box beds represented would be adequate to meet the challenges that seemed to be approaching. The conversations he had heard in the village marketplace spoke of political changes that might transform French society in fundamental ways. And he wondered what such changes might mean for families like his who had found security and comfort in the ancient rhythms of rural life. The questions that would occupy his thoughts as he drifted off to sleep in the warmth and darkness of his box bed were not simply about surviving another winter, but about whether the traditions that had served his family so well would continue to provide security and meaning in a world that seemed to be changing in ways that no one could fully understand or predict. The winter of 1788 to 1789 had been particularly harsh throughout Brittany, and by the time spring arrived in St. Paul de Leon, the box bed communities that had sustained rural families through generations of seasonal hardship found themselves facing challenges that extended far beyond the familiar struggles with cold, hunger, and isolation. The political upheavals that were beginning to transform France had reached even the most remote rural villages, bringing with them new ideas about individual rights, family organization, and domestic arrangements that would fundamentally alter the traditional ways of life that families like the Corries had known for centuries. The first signs of these larger changes manifested themselves in seemingly small alterations to the daily routines and social relationships that had previously characterized box bed communities. Louis Corrie noticed that the evening conversations that took place around the village's common areas had begun to focus less on agricultural concerns and seasonal preparations, and more on abstract questions about rights, representation, and social justice that had previously been beyond the scope of rural discourse. The pamphlets and newspapers that occasionally reached the village from larger towns now carried information about political developments that seemed to have direct implications for rural life. The Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen, with its assertion that all people possessed inherent rights to liberty, property, and security, raised obvious questions about traditional rural social arrangements, including the sleeping accommodations that had been accepted as natural and unchangeable for so many generations. The young people in the village were among the first to begin questioning whether the communal sleeping arrangements that characterized box bed life were compatible with the new ideas about individual rights and personal autonomy that were being discussed throughout France. Jean-Marie Corrie, at 16 the oldest of Louis's children, began to express discomfort with sharing the family's box bed with his younger siblings, arguing that young men should have private sleeping accommodations that respected their dignity and independence. These complaints initially struck Louis and Anne as simply the normal rebelliousness of adolescence, but they began to understand that their son's concerns reflected larger social changes when they heard similar complaints from other parents throughout the village. The traditional authority structures that had governed family organization and domestic arrangements were being challenged by new concepts of individual rights that made the enclosed, communal sleeping arrangements of box bed communities seem restrictive and outdated. The practical implications of these changing attitudes became apparent as families throughout the village began to modify their sleeping arrangements in response to the new social pressures. Some families began to divide their box beds into smaller individual compartments, sacrificing efficiency and warmth for privacy and individual autonomy. Others experimented with alternative sleeping arrangements that provided more personal space and freedom of movement, even when such arrangements were less comfortable or practical than traditional box bed configurations. The Corrie family found themselves caught between their attachment to traditional ways of life that had provided security and comfort and their recognition that the world around them was changing in fundamental ways that could not be ignored. The box beds that had been sources of warmth, privacy, and family bonding began to seem like symbols of an outdated social system that emphasized collective survival over individual expression and family authority over personal choice. The economic changes that accompanied the political revolution also affected the box bed communities in ways that were both subtle and profound. The traditional agricultural economy that had sustained rural Brittany for centuries was being challenged by new ideas about property rights, labor relations, and economic organization that promised to improve the lives of rural workers while also disrupting the established patterns of rural life. Louis Corey's relationship with the local seigneur, which had previously been governed by traditional obligations and mutual responsibilities, began to be redefined in terms of contractual agreements and individual rights that left both parties uncertain about their obligations and expectations. The land that Louis farmed had always been understood to belong to the seigneur. But the revolutionary government's discussions of land, redistribution, and peasant rights raised questions about whether this arrangement was just, or whether it might be changed. These economic uncertainties affected the box bed communities because the sleeping arrangements that had evolved to accommodate extended families and multiple generations were partly based on economic systems that required large households and cooperative labor arrangements. If the economic foundations of rural life were to be transformed, the domestic arrangements that had been designed to support those economic systems might also need to change. The religious changes that were taking place throughout France also had implications for the box bed communities, which had always been closely connected to the Catholic traditions that governed rural life. The revolutionary government's policies toward the Catholic Church created confusion and controversy in villages like Saint Pal de Leon, where religious observance had always been integrated into the seasonal rhythms of rural life. The box beds themselves had religious significance that went beyond their practical functions as sleeping accommodations. The enclosed, private spaces they provided had traditionally been used for personal prayer and religious contemplation, and many families had developed bedtime routines that included prayers and religious instruction that took place within the intimate setting of the box bed environment. The revolutionary government's attempts to replace traditional Catholic practices with new forms of civic religion created conflicts for families who had to choose between their traditional religious beliefs and the new political requirements for citizenship. These conflicts were particularly acute in the intimate setting of the box bed communities, where religious practices had always been integrated into the most personal and private aspects of family life. The changing roles of women in revolutionary French society also affected the box bed communities in ways that challenged traditional patterns of family organization and domestic authority. The revolutionary emphasis on individual rights and civic participation raised questions about women's roles in family decision-making and their authority over domestic arrangements that had previously been considered exclusively within the female domain. Anne Corey found herself in the unusual position of having to defend traditional domestic arrangements that she had always taken for granted, against criticisms that they were inconsistent with the new ideas about women's rights and social equality. The management of box bed sleeping arrangements had always been considered women's work, but the political implications of these arrangements were now being debated in public forums, where women's voices were not always welcome or respected. The education of children in the box bed communities also began to change as the revolutionary government promoted new ideas about childhood, individual development, and the relationship between family authority and civic responsibility. The traditional methods of child-rearing that had been practiced in box bed communities emphasized obedience, cooperation, and adaptation to established social roles. But the new educational philosophies promoted individual expression, critical thinking, and preparation for active citizenship. These changing educational goals created tensions within box bed communities. because the sleeping arrangements that had been designed to teach children about family cooperation and social hierarchy were now criticized as obstacles to individual development and personal autonomy. Parents found themselves caught between their desire to maintain family traditions and their recognition that their children would need to function in a society that operated according to different principles than those that had governed rural life for generations. The physical modifications that families began to make to their box beds reflected these larger social and cultural changes. The Corey family, like many of their neighbors, began to experiment with alterations that would provide more individual space and privacy while still maintaining some of the practical advantages of the traditional arrangements. Louis installed removable partitions in the children's box bed that could create separate sleeping spaces for each child, when privacy was desired while still allowing for shared warmth during the coldest weather. He also modified the ventilation systems to provide better air circulation and more natural light, responding to new ideas about health and hygiene that were being promoted by revolutionary authorities, and began to change the bedding arrangements to provide each family member with individual blankets and pillows rather than the shared coverings that had previously been used. These changes required additional resources and labor, but they reflected the family's adaptation to new social expectations about personal space and individual comfort. The social dynamics of the village began to change as families modified their sleeping arrangements and domestic routines in response to revolutionary pressures. The informal networks of cooperation and mutual aid that had always characterized box bed communities became more difficult to maintain when families were focusing more on individual needs and less on collective survival. The evening gatherings that had traditionally brought together multiple families for shared meals, storytelling, and social interaction became less frequent as families began to emphasize privacy and individual family time. The seasonal rituals that had marked the transition between summer and winter sleeping arrangements began to lose their community-wide character as different. Families adopted different approaches to managing their domestic arrangements. These changes created both opportunities and challenges for the box bed communities. Families gained more control over their domestic arrangements and were able to adapt their living situations to their specific needs and preferences. But they also lost some of the social support and cultural continuity that had been provided by the traditional community-wide approaches to managing seasonal transitions and domestic challenges. The intergenerational tensions that developed within box bed communities reflected broader conflicts between traditional rural values and revolutionary ideals that were occurring throughout French society. Older community members, like Louis's mother Marie, had difficulty understanding why arrangements that provided comfort and security for generations should be changed to accommodate new ideas that seemed to prioritize individual desires over family stability and community cooperation. Younger community members, like Jean-Marie Corey, were eager to embrace changes that promised greater personal freedom and individual opportunity, even when such changes required sacrificing some of the security and comfort that traditional arrangements had provided. These generational conflicts were particularly intense in the intimate setting of box bed communities, where different family members had to negotiate their competing needs and values within the confined spaces of their shared sleeping accommodations. Jacques witnessed the implementation of these land reforms in several communities where his surveying work took him, and he saw both the possibilities and the limitations of political solutions to economic problems. In some cases, the redistribution of land did create new opportunities for agricultural workers and reduce the need for seasonal migration. In other cases, the disruption of established agricultural systems, it created new forms of uncertainty and hardship that affected both settled residents and mobile workers. The changing relationship between wandering workers and settled communities during the revolutionary period reflected broader changes in French society that were transforming traditional social relationships and economic arrangements. The revolutionary emphasis on social equality and mutual solidarity created new possibilities for cooperation between mobile and settled populations. But it also created new tensions and conflicts as different groups competed for scarce resources and political influence. Jacques experienced these changing relationships during a return visit to the village of Saint-Julien-du-Sceau, where he had sought accommodation during his journey from Auxerre to Sens in the autumn of 1788. The same village that had provided him with grudging assistance and marginal accommodations during his previous visit now welcomed him as a legitimate worker who was contributing to the revolutionary transformation of French society. The priest, who had previously been able to offer only limited state assistance, was now working with the village's revolutionary committee to establish more systematic programs for assisting traveling workers. The farmer who had allowed Jacques to sleep in his barn was now participating in cooperative arrangements that provided better accommodations and more opportunities for temporary employment. These changes reflected both the practical benefits of revolutionary policies and the psychological impact of new ideas about social relationships and mutual responsibility. The revolutionary rhetoric about the dignity of working people and the importance of social solidarity had created new expectations about how communities treat transient populations and how individuals should respond to the needs of their neighbors. The seasonal cycle that had always governed the lives of wandering workers was also being affected by revolutionary changes in ways that created both opportunities and challenges. The traditional pattern of spring planting, summer cultivation, autumn harvest, and winter unemployment was being modified by new agricultural techniques, different crop selections, and alternative economic activities that were promoted by revolutionary authorities. Jacques found that his skills and experience as a mobile agricultural worker were increasingly valuable as communities experimented with new farming methods and crop varieties that required workers with diverse experience and adaptability. His knowledge of different regional agricultural practices and his ability to work effectively in various social and economic contexts made him a valuable resource for communities that were trying to implement revolutionary reforms. The documentation and communication systems that were being developed by the revolutionary government also created new possibilities for wandering workers to maintain connections with communities and potential employers across greater distances. Jacques learned to use the revolutionary postal system and the new networks of local committees to share information about employment opportunities and to maintain relationships with people he had met during his travels. The winter of 1789-1790 presented Jacques with sleeping arrangement challenges that were fundamentally different from those he had faced during the previous winter. His improved economic circumstances and his official status as a worker contributing to revolutionary programs gave him access to better accommodations and more secure employment. But they also created new expectations and responsibilities that affected his relationship with other mobile workers and with the communities where he sought assistance. Jacques spent much of the winter in the city of Orleans, where he found employment with a revolutionary committee that was organizing public works projects designed to provide employment for displaced workers and to improve urban infrastructure. The work was steady and well paid, and it provided him with access to organized housing arrangements that were far superior to the marginal accommodations he had previously known. The organized housing for revolutionary workers consisted of dormitory-style accommodations that were specifically designed for working people who were contributing to revolutionary programs. These accommodations provided individual beds with clean bedding, adequate heating, and basic meal services at costs that were subsidized by the revolutionary government. The social environment of the revolutionary workers' housing was characterized by political discussion and education that helped Jacques understand the broader context of the changes that were affecting French society. The other residents included skilled artisans, educated workers, and political activists who shared information about revolutionary developments and discussed their implications for working people. Jacques' participation in these political discussions marked a significant change in his understanding of his own circumstances and his role in French society. For the first time in his life, he began to think of himself not simply as someone who needed to find work and shelter from day to day, but as a citizen who had rights and responsibilities in the revolutionary transformation of his country. The spring of 1790 brought Jacques to a decision point that reflected the broader choices that were facing all French citizens during the revolutionary period. His experience with steady employment and secure housing had shown him that alternatives to wandering existence were possible, but they required him to accept new forms of social organization and political commitment that were different from the independence and flexibility that had characterized his mobile lifestyle. The revolutionary government was offering opportunities for wandering workers to settle in established communities, to receive training in new skills, and to participate in cooperative economic arrangements that promised greater security and stability than mobile existence could provide. These opportunities represented genuine improvements in living conditions and economic prospects, but they also required individuals to give up the autonomy and freedom of movement that had been central to their identities as wandering workers. Jacques' decision to accept a permanent position with the Revolutionary Land Reform Program and to establish residence in a rural community near Sens represented both a personal choice and a symbolic recognition of the changes that were transforming French society. The sleeping arrangements that had once been improvised and temporary became stable and secure, but they also became part of a larger social and political system that imposed new obligations and expectations. As Jacques settled into his first permanent home since childhood, sleeping in his own bed in his own room for the first time in his adult life, he reflected on the journey that had brought him from the desperate, marginal existence of a wandering worker to the relative security and dignity of revolutionary citizenship. The bed itself was simpler wooden frame with a straw mattress and wool blankets, but it represented a fundamental transformation in his relationship to French society and his understanding of his own worth and possibilities. The questions that occupied his thoughts as he settled into this new stability were no longer about where he would sleep the next night or how he would find employment to survive another day. Instead, he found himself thinking about his role in building the new society that the revolution promised to create, and about whether the changes that had improved his own circumstances would extend to other wandering workers who were still struggling to survive on the margins of French society. The revolution of movement that had transformed Jacques' life was both personal and political, reflecting the broader changes that were reshaping France and creating new possibilities for people who had previously been excluded from stable social and economic relationships. The sleeping arrangements that had once symbolized his marginality and insecurity had become expressions of his citizenship and his participation in the revolutionary transformation of his country. The wandering was over, but the revolution had just begun.